Forget everything you've seen in the movies. Forget the cramped, claustrophobic corridors where sailors sleep side by side with torpedoes. What we're talking about today isn't just a submarine. It is the most insane engineering marvel humanity has ever hidden beneath the waves. Imagine a 9-story building made of titanium and steel. Now, imagine this building moving at 50 kilometers per hour at a depth of half a kilometer. And most importantly, inside this building, right next to 2 nuclear reactors, there is a sauna, a solarium, and a real swimming pool with crystal blue water. Sound like the fever dream of a mad architect? Welcome aboard Project 941. In the West, they called it the Typhoon. In the USSR, it was known as the Akula, the shark. It was the Leviathan of the Cold War, capable of single-handedly wiping an entire hemisphere off the face of the Earth. But why did the Soviet Union need to build a submarine cruiser the size of a World War II aircraft carrier? Why did American admirals refuse to believe their eyes when they saw the first satellite images? And where did these steel giants vanish to today? Over the next hour, we will descend into the very heart of this monster. We'll take it apart bolt by bolt, peer into secret compartments, and learn why onboard comfort wasn't a luxury, but a matter of survival. This is a story of fear, genius, and absolute excess. Fasten your seatbelts. We are diving. To truly grasp the scale of the Akula, numbers are useless. The human brain struggles with abstract thousands of tons. Let's compare. Take a standard American Los Angeles-class submarine. Place it next to the Akula. It would look like a lifeboat next to a cruise liner. The Akula's submerged displacement is 48,000 tons. That is more than the heavy aircraft carrier USS Essex, which launched hundreds of planes across the Pacific. Just imagine an object heavier than an aircraft carrier that doesn't float on the surface but flies underwater, governed by the laws of hydrodynamics rather than aerodynamics. In 1990, the world saw the film The Hunt for Red October. Sean Connery, playing a Soviet captain, stood atop the sail of a giant submarine. Audiences thought the boat's size was Hollywood exaggeration, special effects, a fantasy of director John McTiernan. They were wrong. The real Akula was even larger than its cinematic prototype, and unlike the movie, it didn't have a silent caterpillar drive. It had something far more terrifying. It wasn't built to hide in silence. It was built to smash through ice. The sail of this boat was reinforced to punch through 2.5 meters of Arctic ice when surfacing for a strike. Imagine the force of 50,000 tons of steel slamming into an ice sheet from below. The sound of that impact would be heard for dozens of kilometers, if there were anyone on the polar ice cap to listen. But the most surprising thing wasn't the thickness of the armor or the size of the missile silos. It was the philosophy. This was the first and only time in history that the designers of a Doomsday weapon thought about the humans who would pull the trigger. Inside this steel monster was a relaxation zone lined with wood. There were arcade games, there was a gym, and that legendary swimming pool. For Western experts, it was a shock. Soviet submariners, whom propaganda depicted as faceless cogs in the communist machine, were swimming in heated seawater at a depth of 400 meters while waiting for the order to start World War III. It seems absurd. Why waste precious space and tonnage on a pool when every inch of a sub should serve the war effort? The answer doesn't lie in a love of luxury. It lies in fear, and an engineering problem that deadlocked the USSR in the late 1970s. The mid-70s. The Cold War had entered its most dangerous, icy phase. In the offices of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, generals leaned over charts of the ocean floor. The Americans made a bold move. In 1976, they laid the keel for the first Ohio-class submarine. It was a technological masterpiece, quiet, deadly, and carrying 24 Trident ballistic missiles. But the main American advantage wasn't the number of missiles, it was their quality. Trident missiles used solid fuel. This was critical. The liquid fuel used by the Soviet Union at the time was volatile, toxic, and dangerous. A missile had to be fueled and maintained, and the pumps moving that fuel created noise. Noise is death for a submarine. Solid fuel solved everything. The missile is always ready. It's safer to store, and launch is instantaneous. the USSR had to create its own counterpart. Parity had to be maintained at any cost. The task fell to the Rubin Design Bureau and its chief designer, Sergei Kovalev. The assignment was simple, yet impossible. Create a solid fuel missile capable of reaching the U.S. from Soviet territorial waters, and build a boat to carry it. This is where Soviet industry hit a wall of physics. The U.S. chemical industry was far ahead in creating high-energy solid fuel mixtures. The Americans could make a compact charge with immense power. Soviet chemists lagged behind. To achieve the same range and warhead yield, Soviet engineers needed more fuel, much more. The result was the R-39 missile, and it was a behemoth. An American Trident weighed about 30 tons. The Soviet R-39 weighed 90 tons. It was 3 times heavier, 3 times larger, 16 meters long and 2.5 meters wide. These were the dimensions of a small spacecraft, not a tactical weapon. Then came the problem that would stump any shipbuilder. Where on earth do you put it? The standard layout for a submarine is a single pressure hole, a long tube where people live and machinery hums. Missile silos are cut into this tube, but the R-39 was too massive. If they tried to cram it into a conventional hole, the boat would become too long and unstable. It would snap on the waves while on the surface. It would lose its stealth. The project seemed doomed. Either they had to wait 10 years for chemists to invent new fuel, or admit defeat in the arms race. But the Soviet engineering school was famous for turning disadvantages into advantages. American engineers took pride in miniaturization. They made everything small, elegant, and efficient. Soviet engineers responded with brute force and scale. Their logic: if we can't shrink the missile to fit the boat, we will grow the boat to fit the missile. And then some. We won't build a boat with missiles. We will build a floating spaceport around them. The idea was as simple as it was brilliant. If one pressure hole is too small for the missiles, let's use 2. Rubin's designers drew a layout that resembled a catamaran more than a classic submarine. Inside a giant, streamlined, outer, light hull were 2 independent pressure holes running parallel, like the barrels of a double-barreled shotgun. Imagine 2 subway tunnels laid side by side. Each has its own compartments, machinery, and crew. Each tunnel was 7 meters in diameter, enough for 3 decks. But the most interesting part wasn't inside these holes, but between them. In the gap between the 2 main holes, the engineers placed the missile silos. This solved the main problem. The missiles no longer cut through living quarters. They stood in a separate, floodable space, protected on the sides by the heavy steel of the living modules. It was like a knight hiding a sword in a scabbard behind his back, only this sword was 5 stories tall. But that's not all. The Akula isn't just 2 holes. It is a modular construction of 5 pressure-resistant sections. 2 main holes run the length of the boat. The third is the torpedo room in the bow. The fourth is the command module directly under the sail. And the fifth is the stern transition. All of this is linked by a unified system of passageways. You could get lost inside this boat, moving from port to starboard, climbing different levels as if walking through a sprawling bunker. This design gave the boat incredible survivability. If a torpedo pierces one side, the other remains airtight. The power plant is also duplicated. 1 nuclear reactor in each of the main hulls. This made the Akula virtually unsinkable in a standard naval engagement. To sink it, you would literally have to blow it to pieces with multiple hits. However, this survivability came at a price. The dimensions of the outer hull became colossal: 172 meters long, 23 meters wide. To give you a sense of scale, you could turn a Kamaz truck around on the deck of this submarine. The width of the hull allowed for it with room to spare. Western experts studying the Akula's specs called it a water carrier. And it was true. Its reserve buoyancy was unprecedented, about 40%. This means that nearly half the weight of the boat when surfacing was the water it displaced from its ballast tanks. Submerged, it weighed 48,000 tons. Surfaced, it was only 23,000. The difference is 25,000 tons of water the boat took inside its light hull to dive. This created a unique effect. When the Akula moved on the surface, it sat very high in the water. Its draft was deep, yet a mountain of steel 4 stories high still rose above the waves. It was terrifying, like an ancient sea beast surfacing to breathe, showing its massive back. We are used to seeing a submarine as a hunter stalking its prey. But the Akula was not a hunter. It was a massive floating launch platform. Its sole mission was to deliver 20 containers to point X. But what were these containers? Meet the R-39 ballistic missile. NATO reporting name SSN-20, Sturgeon. If you've ever stood next to an ICBM in a museum, you know the feeling. The cold, perfect geometry of death. But the R-39 was special. It was the first Soviet solid-fuel submarine missile that actually worked. And the price of that success was measured in tons. The launch mass was 90 tons. Imagine a modern Boeing 737-800. Fully fueled, with luggage and 180 passengers, it weighs about 80 tons. The R-39 weighs more. Now, imagine that this Boeing doesn't just need to accelerate down a runway. It must be hurled from underwater, from a depth of 50 meters, vertically upward, overcoming the crushing resistance of the ocean. To achieve this, a unique shock-absorbing launch system was developed. The missile didn't just sit in the silo, it hung there like a cradle inside a special launch canister. It didn't touch the walls of the silo. This was critical, as any impact on the hull, from a nearby depth charge or a sharp maneuver, could damage the fragile electronics or the integrity of the solid fuel. A crack in the fuel during launch means an instant explosion. The launch itself was an engineering miracle. When the commander turns the key and presses the launch button, a powder pressure accumulator ignites. This is a giant gas generator. It creates colossal gas pressure at the bottom of the silo. These gases act like a piston in a cannon. First, a gas cavern, a bubble, is created around the missile to reduce water friction. Then, a massive kick of compressed gas ejects 90 tons of metal from the silo. The missile flies out of the water like a cork from a champagne bottle. Only in the air, when it hangs for a split second in weightlessness above the ocean's surface, do the sensors trigger the ignition of the first stage rocket motor. Witnesses of the test said the sound of this launch is impossible to describe. It is a blow that makes your internal organs vibrate. But the most terrifying thing about the R-39 is what it carries in its head. Each R-39 carried 10 MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. Each had a yield of 100 kilotons. For comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons. One Akula warhead is 6 to 7 Hiroshimas. One missile is 60 to 70 Hiroshimas. There were 20 such missiles on board. The simple arithmetic of the apocalypse. 200 nuclear warheads on a single ship. One full volley from Project 941 could destroy 200 major industrial centers. Theoretically, this single submarine could end the existence of a country like Great Britain or France, turning them into radioactive deserts in half an hour. The crew knew exactly what they were sitting on. 160 men lived, ate, slept, and watched movies while literally hugging 2,000 Hiroshimas. For people to live and work beside such monstrous power for months without going insane, they needed the illusion of a normal life. The illusion of home. Imagine the smell. If you've ever been on a military submarine, you know the specific scent. A mix of machine oil, diesel fuel, and sweat. But on the Akula, there was one compartment that smelled of steamed oak, eucalyptus, and ozonated water. Welcome to the floating Hilton. When American submariners first heard that Soviet missile subs had a sauna and a pool, they dismissed it as propaganda. On American Ohio-class boats, the crew lived in Spartan conditions. Hot bunking, where 3 sailors take turns sleeping in 2 bunks, was the norm. And then intelligence reports. The Russians have a pool. It was no exaggeration. The Akula's endurance was 120 days. 4 months without sunlight under crushing psychological pressure. To combat depression and aggression, the designers created a slice of normal life inside the steel Leviathan. The centerpiece was the pool. The walls and floor were lined with blue tiles. It was filled with seawater and heated. Imagine the surrealism. You are swimming in warm water, while just beyond the thin steel hull lies the black abyss of the Arctic and temperatures of -2 degrees. Nearby was a sauna paneled in oak. There was a solarium, a gym, and even a nature corner. In the lounge, there were cages with parrots and canaries, aquariums with fish, and pots with real plants. For a submariner, the sight of a green leaf was profoundly important. Officers lived in 2- and 4-man cabins, sailors in small dormitories. The lounge was finished in wood grain panels, with paintings of Russian landscapes on the walls. It all created the illusion that you were in a sanatorium, not a machine of death. But the illusion was fragile. The moment the battle station's alarm sounded, a net was thrown over the pool, and the canaries went silent, terrified by the vibration of the hull. Comfort served one purpose: keeping the crew fit to fulfill their mission in the realm of eternal ice. The Arctic Ocean. For any normal submarine, the ice pack overhead is a death trap. If an accident occurs, surfacing is impossible. But the safest place for Soviet missile cruisers was beneath the noise of the Arctic pressure ridges, where NATO sonars go blind and deaf. But how do you fire through 2 meters of ice? Soviet engineers turned the boat itself into a hammer. The Akula's sail is an armored fist, reinforced with ultra-high-strength steel to withstand the pressure of breaking through ice up to 2.5 meters thick. Imagine the process. 50,000 tons of metal approach the icy ceiling from below. The boat could hover motionless, balancing its ballast with kilogram precision, like a predator before a pounce. Then, a blast of the main ballast tanks. The colossal force of Archimedes thrusts the Akula upward. Impact. The sail slams into the ice. The screech of metal against ice fills the compartments. But the titanium holds. The ice begins to groan and finally shatters. The giant black hull breaks through the white crust and emerges on the surface. Within minutes, the Akula is sitting in the ice field like a surfaced island. The missile silo covers are cleared of debris. For American recon planes, it was a nightmare. In the middle of the white silence, the ice explodes, and a black silhouette the size of 2 football fields emerges. It meant the game of hide-and-seek was over. The Akula had taken its firing position. Imagine this moment. It begins with silence. With the monolith signal, the order to use nuclear weapons. The commander and the executive officer turn their keys. From that moment, the crew becomes part of the machinery of destruction. No other country in the world besides the USSR practiced the tactic of a full missile volley. Soviet doctrine required the ability to fire the entire payload in one go. 20 missiles, one after another, at 15-second intervals. Each missile weighs 90 tons. As it leaves, the boat instantly becomes lighter. It begins to be shoved toward the surface. But it must stay at a depth of 55 meters. Automation frantically pumps in water to compensate for the weight loss. 15 seconds. The second missile. The third. The 10th. If the Akula fired its entire load, it would lose nearly 2,000 tons of weight in 5 minutes. Holding a giant submarine steady in such a moment is the pinnacle of engineering. Outside, hell breaks loose. 20 pillars of fire and steam pierce the surface. 200 warheads, the entire infrastructure of the U.S. East Coast. Washington, New York, Boston. One submarine carried enough power to wipe out a nation the size of France in 30 minutes. This was the concept of mutually assured destruction rendered in metal. Once the missiles are gone, the crew knows there is nowhere to return. In 30 minutes, their bases will be radioactive ash. But history played a cruel joke on the Akula. It never had to fire on New York. The enemy that destroyed this fleet didn't come from the ocean. It came in the form of signatures on paper and economic reports. In 1991, the Soviet Union vanished. In the New World, there was no place for the Akulas. The economy collapsed. Every voyage of such a boat cost millions. But the main problem was the missiles. The R-39s were manufactured in what was now independent Ukraine. Production chains snapped. The shelf life of the solid fuel began to expire, making the missiles dangerous to the boats themselves. The giant submarines became white elephants, massive, expensive, and useless. Officers went months without pay, but continued to maintain the dying reactors. And then, America offered money for their disposal. Under the Nunn-Lugar program, the U.S. paid to dismantle Soviet subs. The enemy paid for the funeral of its most feared foe. At the Zvezdochka shipyards, giant hydraulic shears turned titanium hulls into scrap metal. The TK-202, TK-12, and TK-13 vanished from the fleet registers one by one. Sailors wept as they watched the autopsies. By the early 2000s, only 3 ships of the mighty division remained. But one boat refused to die. The lead ship of the series, the TK-208 Dmitry Donskoy, got a second chance. Unlike its brothers rusting at the pier, the Donskoy became a unique testbed for the new Russian Bulava missile. It was refitted into a living laboratory. For years, it served faithfully, witnessing the birth of new technologies. It outlived the other Akulas by 20 years. It outlived the country that created it. Its unique design proved to be the perfect platform for testing. Even in its new role, it remained an awe-inspiring sight. But time is relentless. In 2023, the Dmitry Donskoy was finally decommissioned. It left behind a legacy that lives on in new missiles. But the giants themselves are gone forever. The era of dinosaurs ended not because they were weak, but because the climate changed. Today, the Akulas have been replaced by the Bore class, half the size, no pools or saunas, but more efficient and digital. Evolution chose rationality. The Akula remains in history as proof of what humanity is capable of when driven by the wall of fear. We look at photos of these giants with the same awe we feel for the pyramids. Project 941 was a triumph of engineering over economic common sense. The strangest and most magnificent ship ever built by man. With the departure of the Dmitry Donskoy, the final chapter of the superpower standoff beneath the waves has closed. The ocean has become quieter. But if you ever hear the roar of northern waves, remember this story. The story of how men, fearing the end of the world, created a Leviathan that, thankfully, never fired its final shot. The world will never see anything like it again, and perhaps that is for the best. The watch is over. Sleep well, Titans.